Yeah.
Why do we have so many dust storms in central Illinois?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, there's some work that's been done I mean, going back to the 80s, we're trying to piece together dust storms in Illinois at the Water Survey, and yeah, it seems like there's a corridor of the highest dust storm frequency, say from roughly around Edwardsville up to Kankakee, kind of across that central stretch of the state, and it's sort of a combination of many things. So first of all, it's an area that's pretty flat. Um, Mostly during the peak time of April to May, where more dust storms are. Even if the crop has emerged, it's pretty small, so there's not a whole lot of friction, along the surface like big trees, things like that. But also, it's an area where we have a little bit more silt than clay in the soils, and so what that means is that when that topsoil can dry out, those little bit, it's not sandy, but those little bit of larger particles can become more airborne a little bit more easily. The combination of all of those things and a lot of farm work that goes on, whether it be spring tillage practices or planting or whatever, could be field work. All of those things add up to just an area of relatively high frequency of dust storms, relative to northern or southern Illinois.
So that's one of the things that created the problem a couple of years ago back on I-55 south of Springfield.
Yeah, that's right. We had a what was not an abnormal day in April, or I guess it was May 1st, where we have pretty strong winds, not thunderstorm winds. It was sunny outside, but sustained winds of 30 to 40 miles per hour. A pretty dry topsoil. Now, when you get down deep, 6, 8 inches, it was still pretty wet from the spring, but the topsoil was pretty deep, it was pretty dry, and of course it had been worked up in different ways, and the combination just made for a pretty intense blowing dust event that unfortunately caused a lot of accidents on I-55.
And you probably have been part of a lot of conversations from people that say, well, why can't we increase cover crops and change tillage and all of that? And farmers will decide if they want to do that or not, but at least that's one of the solutions. Is it a possible solution then to reducing the what happens after those dust storms?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the thing is that, and that was kind of the point of one of the points in this talk was that, we're not seeing climate change in ways that'll make dust storms more frequent in Illinois, but land management practices matter a lot, and so what the kind of studies that we were citing has showed that even just not necessarily cover crops, although cover crops can do this, but just keeping crop residue on the field until spring can be greatly beneficial in reducing the amount of the potential for windborne erosion. So, cover crops are, of course we talked about this a lot, but cover crops are a challenge for a lot of folks to kind of get their minds around, and it could be practically challenging, especially with termination timing, things like that. But again, just taking it a step kind of simpler to say just leaving that crop residue on there in a lot of ways will reduce the potential for spring, for windborne erosion and dust storms in the spring.
Topic number 2. I have seen in the last couple of days concerns with some weather folks, not necessarily climatologists such as you are, but weather forecasters, indicating that they are becoming more and more concerned about an encroaching drought from the west. And looking at what the drought monitor is showing coming up, and it's coming through Kansas, it's coming up in through Iowa and Missouri and approaching the Mississippi River. I didn't know if you had any thoughts about the potential for a dry spring and
Yeah.
an encroaching drought.
Yeah, so right now we've had pretty dry conditions in the Central Plains, like you spoke to, that have really persisted from last year. That's pretty characteristic of a La Nina winter. They tend to be pretty dry, and they carry that drought into the spring. Here in Illinois, we actually tend to have the opposite signal in spring during La Nina years, and even in late winter, where we actually tend to be quite a bit wetter. Particularly southern and eastern Illinois, those kind of halves, but even in the rest parts of the state, we tend to be a bit wetter. When you look at the outlooks for spring, or even just a 3-month period between February and April, all of them are showing wetter than normal conditions across the entire state of Illinois, and really for the entire eastern Midwest. So as far as going into a dry spring, I'm really not very concerned about that. Now, if we get to April, May, and we haven't seen that wet spring materialize, and we've accumulated soil moisture deficits, then maybe you could be a bit more concerned about drought kind of appearing in this part of the state, or in the state in general. But right now, I'm not really all that concerned about drought. The thing about drought is that we can see dynamics of drought where it can sort of move or migrate from one place to another, but it's not like a storm that actually moves and transects. It's a bit different, and so at this point, pretty limited concern about drought in the state. Yeah.
Any other major concerns that you have that are worthy of discussion?
The southern part of the state, I would just say actually the opposite of drought. It's been a bit wetter there, and the outlook is for wetter conditions. Actually, they just got some precipitation yesterday, and then we have more precipitation from this storm, and the outlook is for another inch to maybe 2 inches down there over the next week. And pretty much every outlook from now until the end of April is wetter than normal. So we may be dealing with some excessively wet soils in that part of the state, the southern Illinois in particular, depending on how the kind of first half of spring wraps up. So we'll see as we get going what that looks like, but that's just something to kind of keep on people's horizon.
A lot of the markets have been watching river levels, Mississippi, Illinois,
Yeah.
Missouri, Ohio, and they don't seem to be recovering very fast, but I know that there's not a lot of reason for them to recover very fast.
Right, yeah, exactly. We haven't been particularly wet across the upper Midwest or the Missouri Basin, so there hasn't been really much reason for them to come up. Like I said, being it's mid-February, I'm not overly concerned. A lot of the flow along our tributary rivers is right at where it typically is this time of year. And that suggests that there's sufficient base flow to keep those small rivers. It's just a cumulative impact of drought in other places, especially out west, that are keeping those big rivers down. But it doesn't take much in February and March and even in April to get those rivers back up, even above levels that we want them to be at. So that's what I was kind of saying. I think it's a little early to worry about drought or transportation issues on the big rivers, especially given the amount of evidence pointing to possibly wetter start to spring.